Before you dive into this story, take a moment to join me on this journey. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the voices, confessions, and truths that too often remain hidden in silence. Leave a comment sharing where you are watching from. Your presence reminds me that these words don't echo into emptiness, but find hearts willing to listen. I froze the moment my eyes caught them. My knees trembled on the damp grass as the autumn wind cut through my coat. I had come to visit my mother's grave, carrying lilies wrapped in white paper, thinking I would kneel there in silence, whisper a prayer, and maybe find some fragile comfort in the routine of loss. But instead, I found my husband. He wasn't standing in mourning or lost in quiet reflection. He was holding another woman's hand, his fingers interlaced with hers as though they belonged together, as though my presence had never existed. The headstone behind them wasn't my mother's, but the sight of them there, in the same cemetery where I returned each week to honor her, felt like a cruel intrusion. The flowers slipped from my hand and landed on the earth with a dull sound, petals scattering in the dirt, my chest collapsing in on itself as if the air had been stolen. I remember hearing the faint creak of the cemetery gate when I first walked in, the crunch of the gravel under my boots, the way I adjusted my scarf against the chill. Everything was ordinary, until it wasn't. Until I saw the man I trusted with my life, the man whose vows still echoed in the corners of my memory, standing just a few rows away, his thumb stroking the knuckles of someone who wasn't me. My throat tightened, but no sound came out. The silence was louder than any scream. I thought of the years we had built together, the mortgage payments split down to the last cent, the weekends painting the living room walls with our hands stained in beige, the hours I had spent cooking meals after 12-hour shifts, believing in the quiet promise of partnership. And in that instant, all of it cracked open, as though I had been pouring water into a vessel riddled with holes. I couldn't move. My body was rooted to the ground, my eyes locked on his, waiting for him to notice me, waiting for his face to fall in shame. But he didn't. He was smiling. A soft, intimate smile, the kind he used to give me when no one else was watching, and he gave it to her. I could feel my pulse thundering in my ears, my fingers curling into fists at my sides, nails digging crescents into my palms. I wanted to rush forward, to shout his name, to tear their hands apart and demand an explanation. But I stood there, frozen by the weight of betrayal, afraid that if I opened my mouth, my voice would shatter into 1,000 unrecognizable pieces. The cemetery around me felt suddenly alive with ghosts. The rustling of leaves was no longer just the wind. It sounded like whispers mocking me, the dead bearing witness to the unraveling of my marriage. I thought of my mother, the woman who taught me how to endure pain with dignity, and wondered if she was watching from somewhere beyond, horrified that her daughter had been reduced to a shadow at the foot of her grave. I wanted to cry out to her, to ask her what to do, but my lips were locked, trembling with unshed words. The woman with him glanced up, her eyes scanning the path, and for a terrifying second, I thought she had seen me, but she didn't. She only squeezed his hand tighter, and he leaned in closer, as if they were sharing some sacred secret I would never be allowed to hear. Memories crashed over me like waves, unrelenting and cruel. The first time he kissed me under the rain outside my college dorm, the way he saved tips from his job at the diner to buy me a silver necklace for our anniversary, the promises whispered into my ear the night he asked me to marry him. I thought of the children we planned but never had, the vacations we postponed year after year to save for a better future, the sacrifices I made without hesitation because I believed his love was steady, like a foundation under our feet. And now, in the quiet of this graveyard, I realized how naive I had been. That foundation had been cracked for far longer than I dared to admit. I just hadn't seen it until the truth stood before me, hand in hand with him. I bent down, almost mechanically, and picked up the lilies I had dropped, brushing the dirt from their petals, though I knew they were already ruined. My mother deserved better than wilted flowers, but I couldn't bring myself to care. My heart was splintering in my chest, bleeding into every thought, every memory. I pressed the flowers against my stomach, gripping them so tightly the stems snapped. I wanted to scream his name, to demand, Why here? Why her? Why now? But instead, I turned on my heel and walked away, each step heavier than the last, the sound of their laughter, because yes, I heard it, faint and unmistakable, chasing me down the path. My vision blurred, but not from the wind. It was from tears I refused to let fall. That night, lying in bed alone, I replayed the image over and over, punishing myself with the details. The way his shoulders relaxed around her, the way his body leaned instinctively toward hers, the unguarded ease that I hadn't seen in years. I thought of all the evenings he had come home late, smelling faintly of cologne I didn't recognize, brushing off my questions with excuses about work. I thought of the holidays where he seemed distracted, scrolling on his phone under the dinner table while I poured wine, pretending not to notice. The signs were there, scattered like breadcrumbs across the years, and I had chosen to sweep them aside, convincing myself that love was about trust, about forgiveness, about patience. But maybe it had always been about blindness. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, each second dragging me deeper into the realization that my life was no longer mine, that everything I thought I had built was nothing more than scaffolding holding up a hollow shell. And somewhere, in the middle of the night, I whispered into the dark, "Mom, what do I do now?" My own voice sounded foreign, raw, and broken, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. I closed my eyes and tried to picture her face, tried to hear her voice reminding me of my worth, but all I saw was him, standing hand in hand with someone who had stolen the smile that used to belong to me. I woke up the next morning to the smell of old coffee and the muffled hum of traffic on Queens Boulevard, the kind of weekday sound that used to make me feel safe because it meant everything was ordinary and on schedule. I patted across the cool kitchen tiles and stared at the magnet board where we kept receipts and grocery lists, that messy collage of a life shared. The February Con Ed bill with my handwriting noting the exact amount, $142.17. The dog-eared loyalty card from the hardware store we used when we repainted the bedroom dove white, the Polaroid of us in Montauk from 2016 with the ocean biting at our ankles. I waited for anger to come like a storm, but what came first was inventory. My brain counted sacrifices the way an accountant counts losses, clinical and relentless. The year we skipped Christmas with my cousins in Miami to save for the down payment. The spring I took extra shifts at the clinic, 4 nights in a row until 2 a.m., so we could replace the broken boiler before December. The 10 grand I moved from my mother's small inheritance into our joint emergency fund because he swore we needed a cushion. I told myself I had done it for us. Now I wasn't sure who us had been. I brewed coffee purely for the ritual. 2 scoops of the dark roast he liked because it was cheaper in bulk at 99 cents an ounce when we bought the big bag from the Dominican market on 47th. I put his favorite mug on the counter out of habit, the chipped one with the faded skyline, then slid it back into the cabinet as if hiding evidence of my own gullibility. The phone buzzed on the table. A message from him at 7:12 a.m. Is crisp and neat like someone who thinks good grammar is the same as honesty. Running late. Client call at 9. Don't wait up for dinner. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. I could have answered with a simple okay. I could have asked who she was. Instead, I typed nothing and felt the silence hum between us like an exposed wire. I showered longer than usual, letting the water pound the crown of my head until the room fogged the mirror. My mother's voice flowed back with the steam, that quiet firmness she used whenever I doubted myself. She had ironed hotel sheets for 23 years. And never once complained about her back. She taught me to keep receipts, to know where the money goes, to notice what people do more than what they promise. She would have asked me for facts. So I toweled off, pulled on jeans and a navy sweater, and sat at the dining table with my laptop, the same laminate surface where we filed taxes every April, line by line, bank statements, calendar entries, receipts in my email, patterns. I wasn't looking for gossip. I was looking for math. The math spoke in quiet little tremors. Uber charges at unusual hours, 11:38 p.m., drop-offs near Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, 4 separate nights over the last 3 months. 2 brunches at a bistro in Park Slope. I had never tried, The kind of place where the eggs cost $18 and the coffee comes in little ceramic cups without handles. A line item labeled Memorial Flowers from a boutique florist in Carroll Gardens, ordered on the 10th of May, the 19th of June, and again on September 9th. The delivery address matched a street that ran parallel to the cemetery. My stomach tightened. I opened our shared calendar and scrolled. On those days, he had added polite blocks marked meetings. I clicked on the attachments. Nothing. I clicked on the locations. Blank. He had scrubbed them clean. At noon, I called him. No accusation, just the practiced cadence of a wife keeping the day moving forward. How was your morning? Did you take the blue folder? Will you be home by 9? He answered with the ease of an actor who has rehearsed the same scene for months. Good. Yes. Probably. Before he hung up, he added a soft "Hey, babe," the kind of soothing tone you might use on a skittish animal. I said nothing about the cemetery. I needed his guard down. I needed to learn the contours of the lie before I walked into it and tore it apart. In the afternoon, I visited my mother's grave the way I had intended to the day before, choosing the time when the light softens over the stones and the neighborhood slows. Calvary, Section 27, Row J, Plot 19. I cleaned the bronze vase, tucked in fresh lilies, and told her what I had seen in a voice that refused to crack, even when my throat burned. I said his name and felt the syllables lodge like splinters. I told her I was tired of being gentle. A breeze lifted the paper from the flower wrapping and flipped it like a slow wave. I remembered being 15 and watching her count tips at the kitchen table, $13.50 in singles, her lips moving as she set aside a portion for rent, for groceries, for my SAT class. She had taught me what value feels like in a palm. I pressed my hand to the headstone and promised I would not waste hers on a man who couldn't hold mine in daylight. 2 blocks from the cemetery, there was a bakery with a crooked awning where the owner called me Querida and always tucked an extra butter cookie in the bag. I bought a coffee and sat by the window pretending to read emails while I waited. At 5:42 p.m., I saw him across the street, his stride unmistakable even from behind, the tilt of his shoulders that used to make me smile when he walked toward me after a long day. He was alone, hands in his coat pockets, scanning his phone as he reached the corner. He crossed toward the florist and disappeared inside. I counted the minutes. 4, 7, 11. He re-emerged with a white paper bundle bound by twine and headed toward the stone gates. I followed at a distance that felt both ridiculous and necessary, my heart knocking a steady drumbeat against my ribs. He took the path along the fence line, past the tall marble angel I always used as my landmark, and veered right toward a newer section where the grass still showed seams. He stopped at a headstone I couldn't read from where I stood, knelt, and laid the flowers down with such tenderness that my anger briefly misfired and turned into confusion. He bowed his head. I crept closer until the letters came into focus. The name was not his. It wasn't mine. It wasn't my mother's. It was a woman I had never heard of. Beneath her name were 2 dates, 1991 to 2022, 31 years. A small oval photo showed a face with kind eyes and a tilt of mischief at the corners of her mouth. My gut twisted. This wasn't a mistress's stone. This was a grave. I stood there trembling, hidden behind a U, while he spoke to the stone under his breath. I caught fragments. I miss you. I'm trying. I know. The air thinned around me. It took a full minute before I understood that the woman whose hand he had held the day before was not standing here now because she was the one under the stone. The woman in the cemetery had been someone else entirely. A sister. The hair. The resemblance in the jawline. They had been holding hands because grief had welded them together, not because love had. The realization didn't erase the fact that he had lied to me. It didn't erase the Uber receipts, the secrecy, the tenderness aimed somewhere I did not live, but it shifted the ground beneath my feet. I had thought the story was betrayal. It was something messier. It was grief hoarded in a separate room. When he left, I waited 5 minutes before approaching the grave. I read her name again. A surname that rang a distant bell from a story he once told about college, a study group, a late-night trip to Chinatown for noodles, the kind of anecdote you nod through and forget. I took a photo of the headstone, not to weaponize it, but to anchor myself to a fact that wouldn't move when my feelings did. On the base of the stone, there was a line etched in gold leaf, always called everyone home. I pressed my thumb to the words and felt the chill of the letters. A memory flashed of my husband last Thanksgiving, slipping outside during dessert to take a call, returning with red eyes and saying it was the office. I had believed him because believing kept the pie warm. That night I confronted him, not with a scream but with a question honed to a point. "Who is she?" He froze, and I watched the mask of ease stutter on his face. He tried the old reflex first. "Which she?" Then I said the name from the stone, evenly, as if I were confirming a restaurant reservation. He sat down slowly, hands clasped. He told me she had been his closest friend, almost family, someone who understood him before I did, someone who had gotten sick in late 2021 and was gone by March. He said he had gone numb and then private, the way some men go secret because they are weak at grief and think silence is love. He admitted he had kept the ritual of visiting, every month or so, sometimes with the sister, sometimes alone. He said he didn't tell me because he was ashamed that the grief he felt did not include me, that it felt older and more selfish than the vows he made. I listened, and while he spoke, a second story unfurled beneath his. The old patterns of our marriage, the times he had asked me to be small for the sake of peace. The year he suggested I decline the promotion at the clinic because his schedule was hectic and someone had to be home for the contractor. The Christmas he insisted we host his parents, even though my mother was in the hospital and I wanted to spend the day by her bed. His family's gentle manipulations dressed in polite words. "If you loved us, you would. You are so good at taking care of things. You are the strong one." I realized that I had been making the requested impossible my default setting for years. Carry it all. Smile. Ask for nothing. When he finished, he reached for my hand across the table like a man choosing mercy and hoping it would arrive. I kept my hand where it was and counted the seconds between us. Then I told him about the Uber receipts, the flowers, the blank calendar entries. I told him about the moment I saw him and the sister holding hands near my mother's grave, and how it felt like a blade in the oldest part of me. I told him that grief was not a sin, but secrecy was, and that secrecy grows mold in a marriage until you live with spores in your lungs and call it air. He looked at the floor and said, "I am sorry," in a voice that was not performative, which somehow hurt more because it meant it was real. I slept on the couch, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I needed the rectangle of space that was mine alone. The refrigerator hummed like a slow animal through the night. At 3 a.m, I opened my mother's tin of papers and pulled out the small locket she used to wear on hard days. Inside was a photo of me at 8 with hair too short and a grin too wide. I held it until the edges warmed under my fingers. I thought about the headstone's inscription, "Always called everyone home." Then I asked myself where home was for me now, in a marriage where the truth had been stored somewhere I did not have a key. I drifted into a shallow sleep with that question pinned above me like a ceiling star. The next morning, I walked through the city with a kind of aimless determination, like a ghost trying to retrace the steps of a life it once understood. The September air was cool but sharp, the kind that cuts through fabric and skin and finds its way into bone. I ended up at the clinic 2 hours early, my badge clattering against the glass door as I let myself in. The fluorescent lights flickered awake above me, humming their sterile song. I sat at my desk and opened files I had already finished, pretending to review charts, but the words blurred into gray smudges. My mind kept circling back to the grave, the name carved in stone, the way my husband's shoulders had curved when he placed those flowers down. I couldn't decide what hurt more, that he had hidden this ritual from me, or that he had shared it so openly with someone else. For years I had built my life around his needs without even realizing it. When he wanted to take night classes in 2014, I rearranged my shifts to cover more evenings. When his mother got sick in 2017, I canceled a rare weekend trip with friends to help drive her to appointments. Even the mortgage payments were calculated around his comfort, splitting them down the middle even though I earned less, because he said it was about fairness. And I had agreed, always agreed, because love meant compromise. But as I sat under the clinic lights, I realized what I had called compromise was often just surrender. My mother used to say, "If you bend too much, one day you won't remember how to stand." I felt the truth of that warning burning in my chest. By lunchtime, I couldn't eat. I walked instead, letting the city's rhythm carry me. Vendors shouted at corners, a saxophone wailed near the subway steps, and children in navy uniforms tugged at their mothers' sleeves. Life was still moving, indifferently, while mine was stuck in the quicksand of betrayal and grief. I passed a jewelry store and stopped when I saw a necklace in the window. Silver, simple, almost identical to the one he had given me on our second anniversary. I remembered how proud he was, how he told me he had worked extra shifts at the diner to afford it, how he clasped it around my neck with trembling fingers. That necklace had once symbolized sacrifice. Now, looking at the twin in the window, all I could see was the price tag and the question of whether sacrifice had always been one-sided. When I got home, the apartment smelled faintly of his cologne, the one I used to press my face into after long days, savoring its clean, peppery scent. Now it clung to the curtains like a stranger's perfume left behind at a hotel. He was in the living room scrolling through his laptop, casual, as if nothing had shifted in the tectonic plates of our marriage. He looked up and smiled, that practiced curve of lips that no longer reached his eyes. "Rough day?" he asked. I nodded, but my throat was tight with words I couldn't shape. I wanted to scream about the years of silence, about the weight of my sacrifices, about the way my life had been bent around his needs until I barely recognized my own reflection. Instead, I walked past him and set my bag down quietly, each motion deliberate, controlled, as if control was the only thing I had left. That evening, while he showered, I opened the drawer of the desk we shared and pulled out a folder I had avoided for months. Inside were documents I had kept hidden even from myself, old bank statements, his medical insurance forms, receipts I never bothered to reconcile. One by one, I laid them on the table like pieces of a puzzle. Patterns emerged again, this time sharper. A series of cash withdrawals, not enormous but steady, every other Friday like clockwork. Insurance claims for medications I didn't recognize. Payments to a private therapist, sessions he never mentioned, conducted under a different address. I felt the ground tilt beneath me. It wasn't only grief he had hidden, it was an entire shadow life, stitched together with quiet omissions and half-truths. I couldn't breathe. I stumbled into the balcony and pressed my palms against the cold railing, gulping in air as if I had been drowning. From the street below came the smell of roasted peanuts from a cart, the faint honk of a cab, the laughter of teenagers drifting upward. Normal life, ordinary life, while mine had been rewritten without my consent. I thought again of my mother, how she had endured decades of exhaustion, but had never allowed herself to be silenced. She had told me once, after my father left, "The cruelest lie is the one you help build because you're too afraid to see it." And now I saw it, brick by brick. I wasn't just a victim of his secrecy. I had been its accomplice, smoothing over the cracks, telling myself it was just stress, just grief, just bad timing. When he came out of the shower, hair damp and smelling of soap, he kissed my forehead lightly, automatically. I didn't flinch, but I didn't lean in either. He didn't notice. Or maybe he chose not to. He sat on the couch and flicked through the channels as if this was any other night. And I realized with startling clarity that the life we shared had become a stage set, carefully arranged to look convincing from the outside, but hollow when touched. I was living in a theater of normalcy, applauding lines I didn't believe, waiting for a curtain that never fell. I went to bed early, lying stiff beneath the sheets, listening to his even breathing beside me. My mind kept circling the same words, looping them until they etched themselves into me. Years of sacrifice. A family built on manipulation. A truth hidden in shadows. I closed my eyes and felt the tears slip silently onto the pillow, but this time they weren't just tears of pain. They were the beginning of something sharper. Something that felt dangerously close to resolve. The following week I carried myself like a stranger inside my own skin. Each morning I woke before dawn, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady tick of the clock on the nightstand. I remembered when that sound had comforted me, when it meant time was moving forward, carrying us toward anniversaries, toward dreams we had mapped together. Now it mocked me, every tick a reminder that I was stuck in the same house with a man I no longer recognized. I cooked breakfast out of habit, scrambled eggs with toast, poured coffee into 2 mugs. But when I set his cup on the table, I noticed my hands trembled. He reached for it, smiled his distracted smile, and I wondered if he even tasted it anymore, or if everything between us had become automatic gestures, performed without thought or care. At work, I found myself drifting. Patients told me their symptoms, but my mind wandered to the cemetery, to the stone with her name, to the sister's hand clutching his. I replayed the scene until it no longer felt like memory, but like a cruel film reel spliced into my head. I kept asking myself how many years I had been blind, how many lies had slipped past me dressed as ordinary days. A colleague asked if I was all right, said I looked pale, and I almost laughed. If only she knew that pale was the least of it, that I felt hollowed out, scraped clean, as though my ribs were just scaffolding for a heart that had stopped trusting. One evening I returned home and found him sitting in the dark, the television off, his face lit only by the glow of his phone. The sight startled me, not because he was home early, but because his posture was so unlike him. Shoulders slumped, head bowed. For a moment, I thought he was praying, though I had never seen him do that in all our years together. When he lifted his head, his eyes were red. He shoved the phone aside quickly, too quickly, like a child hiding stolen candy. I stood in the doorway, my bag slipping from my shoulder, and asked in the calmest voice I could manage, "Who are you talking to?" He shook his head, muttered something about work, about stress, and moved past me toward the kitchen. The lie sat between us like smoke, invisible but suffocating. Later, when he fell asleep, I picked up the phone he had abandoned. The screen was locked, but the faintest notification glowed at the top. A name I didn't know. A message preview. "I still can't believe she's gone. Thank you for keeping her alive for me." My stomach lurched. The words felt like ice water poured over my chest. It wasn't an affair, not in the way I had first thought. It was grief tethered to someone else, grief shared like a private currency that excluded me. And yet, betrayal doesn't always come dressed in lust. Sometimes it comes dressed in secrets you were never allowed to carry. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the faint city lights seeping through the blinds, listening to his slow breathing. I thought of the years I had sacrificed, the graduate program I abandoned because he said tuition was too steep, the job opportunity in Boston I turned down because he didn't want to move, the countless weekends I spent caring for his parents instead of visiting my cousins or traveling with friends. All of it justified as partnership, as love, as building something together. But if he could build a sanctuary of grief with someone else and shut me out of it, then what had my sacrifices bought me? The question gnawed at me, raw and relentless. 2 days later, his sister-in-law, the same woman whose hand he had held at the grave, called me. Her voice was tired, heavy with something unspoken. She asked if we could meet, said she needed to explain. We sat across from each other in a diner with cracked red booths, the kind that smelled faintly of grease and burnt coffee. She stirred her tea without sipping, eyes darting everywhere but at me. Finally, she said, "He promised her he'd never let her be forgotten. That's why he goes. That's why he hides it. He doesn't know how to tell you without feeling like he's betraying you too." My chest tightened. Betrayal. The word twisted like a blade because whether it came from silence or touch, it still cut the same. I walked home in the rain, the city shimmering in puddles under neon lights. My coat clung to my skin, heavy and damp, but I barely noticed. The truth was messier than I had imagined. It wasn't just an affair. It was loyalty to a ghost. A loyalty strong enough to eclipse the vows he had made to me. And I couldn't decide which was worse. Part of me wanted to forgive the secrecy, to call it grief, to tell myself love is complicated. But another part, the part that remembered my mother's tired hands scrubbing hotel sheets, the part that had given up years of dreams to hold our life together, New forgiveness without honesty is nothing more than surrender. That night, as I hung my wet coat and sat in the silence of our apartment, I realized something had shifted in me. The anger was still there, sharp and alive, but underneath it grew a quiet clarity. I had lived too long in shadows cast by his choices. It was time to drag them into the light, no matter how blinding it might be. The confrontation came almost without planning, as if the weight of silence finally became too heavy to hold. It was a Sunday evening, the city outside muted by drizzle, the kind of weather that makes everything feel slower, heavier. He sat on the couch with a blanket draped over his legs, a glass of bourbon in his hand, the amber light catching the rim. I stood in the doorway, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. For a moment, I just watched him, the man I had once believed was my anchor, looking so ordinary, so familiar, and yet entirely foreign. Then I asked the question that had been burning holes in my chest. When were you planning to tell me the truth? His eyes snapped up, and I saw the flicker of fear before he masked it with that practiced calm. What truth? He said, his voice measured, almost gentle, as if speaking to a child on the verge of a tantrum. But I wasn't a child, and this wasn't a tantrum. I stepped into the room, the hardwood floor creaking under my weight, and repeated the name from the grave. Her name tasted bitter on my tongue. He flinched, barely, but enough. I know about her, I said. I know about the flowers, the cemetery, the sister, the secrets. I know you've been living a life I was never invited into. He set the glass down slowly, his hands trembling just enough to rattle the ice. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, with a voice that sounded smaller than I had ever heard, he said, I didn't know how. I didn't know how to tell you without breaking us. The irony of his words pressed into me like a bruise. Breaking us? We were already broken. The cracks had been spreading for years, invisible at first, until the entire foundation had become a web of fractures. You could have told me anything, I whispered. You could have let me in, but instead, you let me believe I was the only one carrying the weight. His face crumpled then, and for the first time in a long time, I saw unguarded grief. He told me about the hospital visits, the late-night calls, the promises he had made at her bedside. He spoke of her laughter, how it filled the room even when she was weak, how she had asked him not to forget her. And he confessed that he couldn't bear to bring that grief into our marriage, because he thought it would diminish what we had. But what he didn't understand, what he never seemed to understand, was that shutting me out had diminished it far more than any sorrow ever could. As he spoke, I realized this wasn't just about her. This was about us, about every time he had asked me to set aside my dreams for his, about every sacrifice I had made in silence, about every manipulation disguised as compromise. The cemetery, the secrecy, the grief, they were symptoms of a disease that had been growing between us for years. A disease of imbalance, of unspoken expectations, of me bending until I no longer knew my own shape. And now, sitting across from him, I felt the weight of those years pressing down on me like stones. I can't do this anymore, I said, my voice steady even as my chest ached. He looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing me for the first time in years. Don't say that, he pleaded, his voice breaking. But I wasn't threatening. I was stating a fact. I have spent too many years burying myself to keep this marriage alive. I won't bury myself any deeper. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, filled with all the words we had never spoken. I stood and walked to the window. The city lights blurred through the rain. My reflection stared back at me, pale and tired, but unbroken. For the first time, I didn't see a woman defined by his choices, or by his secrets. I saw a woman standing at the edge of something terrifying but necessary: freedom. The realization scared me, but it also lit something inside me, a flicker of strength I thought I had lost. Behind me, he whispered my name, a sound filled with desperation, but I didn't turn. I pressed my palm to the glass, feeling the coolness seep into my skin, and thought of my mother, of her resilience, of her warning that bending too far would leave me unable to stand. I had bent long enough. It was time to rise, no matter how painful it would be. The days that followed felt like walking across a bridge made of glass. Every step I took threatened to shatter beneath me, yet I kept moving because standing still meant drowning in the silence we had built. He tried, in his way, to restore the rhythms of normal life, texting me about groceries, asking if I wanted to watch a movie, offering to cook dinner. But each gesture felt rehearsed, like props handed out in a play where the audience had already left. I responded politely, mechanically, but inside I felt an expanding emptiness, a realization that routine could no longer disguise what we had lost. One evening, I found myself in the closet, pulling out an old shoebox I hadn't touched in years. Inside were letters I had written to myself in my 20s, small fragments of hope scribbled on scrap paper and tucked away as reminders of who I wanted to be. One note read, "Never let anyone convince you that your dreams are too heavy. If they love you, they'll help you carry them." My hands shook as I held the faded ink, because somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that truth. Somewhere, I had let his needs eclipse mine until I couldn't even remember the shape of my own desires. I decided to start small. I booked a weekend alone, a modest inn 2 hours north, nothing extravagant, just space that belonged only to me. When I told him, his face faltered. "Without me?" he asked, as if the idea of me existing independently was a foreign concept. I nodded. "Yes, without you." He tried to protest, to wrap it in concern. "Are you sure you'll be okay driving alone? Won't it feel lonely?" But I could hear the edge of control underneath. I smiled politely, but inside, something fierce rose in me. "I'll be fine," I said, my voice firm. And for once, I believed it. The drive upstate was quiet, the kind of quiet that allows thoughts to settle like dust. The leaves had begun to turn, red and gold streaking the hillsides, and the crisp air through the window felt like a cleansing breath. I pulled into the inn's gravel lot, checked into a room with a quilted bedspread and creaky floorboards, and for the first time in years, I sat in silence without feeling like I owed anyone anything. I walked the trails alone, let the cold air sting my cheeks, and whispered my mother's name into the trees. I told her I was trying to remember who I was before I spent my years bending. On the second night, I wrote in a journal, filling pages with truths I had never spoken aloud. I wrote about the night shifts, the canceled dreams, the lies he had spun so smoothly. I wrote about the cemetery, the headstone, the secret grief he had hidden from me. And then I wrote about myself, not as his wife, not as someone's daughter, but as a woman who still had a spine, still had a voice. The words flowed like water, and by the time I closed the journal, I felt lighter, as if I had peeled away a layer of someone else's skin. When I returned home, he was waiting at the door, hopeful, like a man expecting forgiveness to walk in alongside me. He asked how it was, and I said, simply, "Good." He wanted details, wanted to fold my experience back into his orbit, but I kept them for myself. Not out of spite, but out of necessity, because they were mine, and mine alone. And for the first time in our marriage, I realized that I didn't have to explain every corner of myself to him. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and felt a strange peace settle over me. The anger was still there, the hurt, the grief, but beneath it all was something steadier, something that whispered I was no longer trapped. I wasn't healed, not yet, but I was awake. Awake to the lies, awake to my sacrifices, awake to the possibility of a life where I no longer bent until I broke. The morning light crept through the blinds in thin golden stripes, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of dread pressing against my chest. Instead, I felt a strange stillness, as though I had stepped outside of the storm for a brief breath of air. He was still asleep beside me, his face relaxed in a way it never was when awake, and I studied him in silence. There was a time I would have reached for him, brushed the hair from his forehead, whispered his name. Now I only felt distance, as though he were a portrait I had once loved but now recognized as a copy. I rose quietly, padded to the kitchen, and poured coffee into my mother's old mug, the one I had wrapped carefully in newspaper after she died. afraid it would break if I used it too often. The ceramic was chipped at the rim, but when I pressed it to my lips, it tasted like memory. I thought of her words again, the warning she had repeated so many times. Don't trade your soul for the comfort of someone else's silence. At the time, I had thought she was talking about her own marriage, about the man who had left her with nothing but bills and my teenage stubbornness to feed. Only now did I understand she had been speaking to me too, across the years. Later that day, I opened the closet and began to pack. Not in the frantic rush of someone fleeing, but in the calm, deliberate rhythm of someone reclaiming. A few dresses, jeans, my journal, the locket. I placed them carefully into a suitcase that still bore the airline tags from our last trip together. A trip I had organized, paid for, and spent most of cooking because he had wanted to relax. As the zipper closed, a clarity settled inside me. I didn't know exactly where I would go or how long I would stay away, but I knew I needed distance. Not just for air, but for survival. When he came home that evening and saw the suitcase by the door, his face collapsed into panic. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice cracking, and I could see the terror in his eyes. For a moment, guilt pricked at me. I almost softened, almost told him it was temporary, almost offered him reassurance he hadn't earned. But then I remembered the cemetery, the secrecy, the years of sacrifice I had poured into a life that had left me empty. I straightened my shoulders and said, "I'm leaving. I don't know for how long, but I can't stay here and keep pretending." He tried to stop me, words tumbling over each other. Apologies, promises, half-explanations. He reached for my arm, but I stepped back. "Don't," I said firmly, and the sharpness in my tone startled even me. "This isn't about you anymore. This is about me." His lips parted as though to argue, but no sound came. For once, he had nothing left to say. I dragged the suitcase into the hallway, the wheels echoing off the walls, and when the door shut behind me, I felt the weight shift. It wasn't freedom yet, not entirely. It was the terrifying in-between, the place where everything is unknown. But it was mine, my choice, my step forward. As I walked down the stairwell, I whispered my mother's name, as if she could hear me, as if she could see her daughter finally standing tall. The taxi ride away from the apartment felt surreal. The city lights blurred past, neon and shadow, and I pressed my forehead to the cool glass of the window. My hands shook, but not from fear, from release. I had carried his secrets, his grief, his manipulations for so long that setting them down left me trembling. I didn't know what awaited me on the other side of this decision. Loneliness, rebuilding, maybe even more pain. But I knew one thing with certainty. I was no longer invisible. That night, in a small rented room with peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of lavender cleaner, I lay on a bed that wasn't mine and felt more at home than I had in years. I opened my journal and wrote a single line. "Today, I chose myself." The words looked strange on the page, like they belonged to someone braver than me. But as I stared at them, I realized they were mine, and I was braver than I had ever allowed myself to believe. The first week on my own was a blur of small, unfamiliar freedoms. I woke without the sound of his alarm, without the shuffle of his shoes on the floorboards, without the tension that had wrapped itself around our mornings for so long. The silence was not oppressive this time. It was liberating. I cooked only for myself, simple meals of eggs and toast or bowls of pasta, and I ate them at odd hours, no longer tied to anyone else's schedule. I left dishes in the sink when I felt like it. I played music loud enough to rattle the windows, something I hadn't done in years because he said he needed quiet to think. It was strange how quickly the absence of his presence became a kind of relief, but relief came laced with guilt. Each night, when the city outside settled into darkness, I lay awake replaying everything, the moment at the cemetery, the years of sacrifices I had made without question, the lies, both big and small, that had corroded the foundation of our life together. I wondered if leaving had been an act of strength or cowardice. My mother's voice echoed in my mind, telling me that standing up for yourself is never weakness, but sometimes the echoes of love make even the right choice feel like betrayal. One evening, I walked to a small park near the rented apartment. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and smoke from a food cart. Children laughed on the swings, their voices carrying into the night. And I thought of the children we never had. For years, I told myself it was fate, bad timing, maybe biology. But now, with distance, I realized it had been something else. An unspoken wall between us. His reluctance, his distractions, the way he had always kept one foot outside the door of our shared future. I sat on a bench and let the cold seep into my skin, tears spilling freely, mourning not only what I had lost, but also what I had never been given the chance to hold. Days blurred into one another, and still he called. Missed calls, voicemails, texts filled with apologies and pleas. I'm sorry. Come home. We can fix this. I'll tell you everything. At first, I ignored them. Then one night, curiosity got the better of me and I pressed play on a voicemail. His voice cracked with desperation. He said he couldn't sleep, that he kept dreaming of me walking away, that he was terrified of losing me. For a moment, my resolve wavered. I almost believed the sincerity, almost believed he was ready to change. But then I remembered the years of promises that had led nowhere, the rehearsed apologies that smoothed over cracks without repairing the foundation. Change wasn't a word, it was an action, and I hadn't seen it yet. On the fourth day, I called his sister, the one whose hand he had held at the grave. My voice shook as I asked her questions I had been afraid to speak aloud. Who was this woman, really? What role had she played in his life? Why had it been kept from me? The sister hesitated, then sighed heavily, as though the weight of silence had exhausted her too. She told me truths I wasn't sure I was ready to hear, that the woman he mourned had once been more than just a friend, that their bond had blurred lines long before I entered his life, that even after she was gone, he had carried her memory like a secret marriage. Hearing it felt like being struck across the face. The betrayal wasn't just in his silence. It was in the history he had chosen never to share, in the ghost of a relationship that had lived in the shadows of mine. That night, I sat by the window of my small room, staring at the lights of the city blinking like distant stars. I pressed my forehead against the glass and whispered, I don't know how to forgive this. The air felt heavy, my chest tighter than ever. But as the minutes passed, a strange clarity began to settle. Forgiveness wasn't the question anymore. Survival was. Healing was. Choosing myself, again and again, until the act became less foreign and more natural. I wrote in my journal until my hand ached. I wrote about the manipulation, the sacrifices, the years of bending. I wrote about the cemetery and the grave and the impossible promise he had kept to someone else. I wrote about myself, not as his wife, not as the victim, but as a woman standing at the edge of her own story, deciding whether to step forward or retreat into the familiar pain. And as I closed the journal, I felt something shift inside me, a seed of resolve, fragile but real, that whispered I could keep walking, even if the road ahead was still shadowed. The following weekend, I visited my mother's grave again, this time alone, without the shock of betrayal clouding my vision. I carried roses instead of lilies, their deep red petals trembling in the cool wind. As I knelt to place them by her stone, I let myself cry in a way I hadn't before. Loud, raw sobs that tore through my chest and echoed in the quiet cemetery. I told her everything, as if she were still alive, as if she could reach across the veil and hold me. I told her about the lies, the secrecy, the woman whose memory had eclipsed my marriage. I told her about the years of sacrifice, how I had bent until I couldn't remember the shape of my own spine. And then I told her I had finally left. Saying it aloud to the earth, to her name carved in granite, made it feel real in a way nothing else had. I stayed there for hours, tracing the letters of her name with my fingertips, feeling the cold seep into my knees. A family passed by, a little girl holding her father's hand, and for a moment I imagined myself as that child again, small and innocent, before love had taught me how sharp it could be. I whispered to my mother that I was trying to find my way back to that girl, the one who believed she deserved joy without conditions, the one who hadn't yet learned to bend under someone else's weight. When I finally stood, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. I walked slowly back to the gates, and halfway down the path, I saw him. He was standing near the section where she was buried, the woman who had haunted our marriage, holding another bouquet of flowers. Our eyes met across the rows of stones, and for a long, heavy moment, neither of us moved. His face was pale, weary, marked by a grief that was no longer a secret. He took a step toward me, but I shook my head. I couldn't do it. Not there, not in front of all that loss. I turned and walked away, my heartbeat pounding in my ears, my hands trembling. Back in my rented room, I couldn't shake the image of him standing there, flowers in hand, carrying two griefs at once, hers and mine. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe that was the cruelest truth of all, that he had loved us both in different ways, and I had been asked to live in the shadow of a ghost I never even knew existed. It wasn't only betrayal, it was a request that had been impossible from the beginning, to compete with the dead. The thought settled over me like a weight, but instead of crushing me, it clarified something. I couldn't save him from that grief. I couldn't erase her memory, nor could I forgive the lies that had kept me blind for so long. What I could do was choose myself, again and again, until the choice became habit, until it became the foundation of a new life. That night, I wrote another line in my journal. I will not live in someone else's shadow anymore. The words felt steady, unshakable, like stones laid on a new path, and for the first time since everything unraveled, I believed them. The days that followed were filled with small acts of rebuilding, each one fragile but necessary. I bought groceries for myself, only the things I liked. Fresh berries, good bread, a bottle of wine I didn't have to share. I rearranged the furniture in my rented room so the bed faced the window, because I wanted to wake up to light instead of shadows. I started running again, my feet pounding the pavement in steady rhythm, lungs burning as if they were learning to breathe differently. These weren't grand gestures, but they felt like stitches pulling together a life that had been torn wide open. Still, there were nights when loneliness slipped in like a draft under the door. I would lie awake, remembering his laugh in our early years, the way his hand had felt warm in mine, the dreams we once sketched out on scraps of paper. I wondered if part of me would always long for that version of us, the one that never really existed beyond the first act of our marriage. I cried sometimes, quietly, into the pillow, not for him, but for the years I had lost, for the woman I had been before I buried myself in sacrifice. One evening, I received an envelope in the mail with his handwriting on it. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written in a shaky script. He confessed everything, how he had loved her once, how he had never let go even after she died, how he had built a wall of silence because he didn't know how to grieve without losing me too. He begged for another chance, promised honesty, promised change. I read it twice, tears blurring the ink, but by the end, the words rang hollow. Promises were easy to write. Actions had always been harder. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer with my journal, not to treasure it, but to remind myself of what I had survived. Because the truth was, even if he meant every word, it didn't erase the years of manipulation, the secrets, the sacrifices I had made in silence. Love without trust is just longing dressed in disguise, and I had already spent too much of my life longing for something that would never come. That night, I sat by the window with a glass of wine and whispered to my mother again. I'm learning, I told her. I'm learning how to stand without bending, how to breathe without asking permission, how to live without apologizing for needing more. The city hummed outside, alive and relentless, and for the first time I felt part of it again, not as someone hidden in the shadows of another's life, but as a woman with her own story. The next morning, I made a list, not of chores or obligations, but of dreams, places I wanted to travel, books I wanted to read, skills I wanted to learn. I wrote down small things too, buying flowers for myself, cooking a recipe my mother once loved, walking along the river at sunset. Each line felt like a reclamation, a promise to myself that I would no longer let sacrifice be my only language. As I folded the paper and tucked it into my journal, I realized something that made my chest ache with both sadness and relief. The marriage I had fought to protect for so many years had already ended long before I walked out the door. What remained now was not mourning for him, but rebirth for me. The weeks slipped by with a strange mixture of pain and discovery, like learning to walk again on unsteady legs. I rented a small apartment downtown, nothing fancy, just 2 rooms with peeling paint and a crooked window that looked out onto a noisy street. Yet the first night I slept there, surrounded by the hum of passing cars and distant laughter from the bar below, I felt a kind of freedom I hadn't known in years. The walls were bare, the furniture secondhand, but the air belonged to me. Every breath I took was mine alone. I began to rebuild routines, slowly, intentionally. On Saturdays, I went to the farmer's market, choosing vegetables my mother once loved, remembering the way she used to hum while chopping onions in our tiny kitchen. I cooked meals just for myself, plated them with care, and ate them slowly, savoring each bite. It was a simple act, but it felt like reclaiming something I had given away long ago. The right to nourish myself without guilt, without apology. Work became steadier, too. I threw myself into my patient's needs, but this time I did it differently. I no longer stayed late just because someone else's schedule demanded it. I learned to say no, to draw lines in ink instead of pencil. My colleagues noticed. One of them, a friend I hadn't confided in, said softly one day, "You seem lighter." I smiled, not because the pain was gone, but because I was finally carrying it differently. Yet grief was still there, threaded through everything. Some nights I dreamed of him, not the man he became, but the man I thought he was, the one who once made me believe we could build a forever. I would wake with tears on my pillow, my chest aching as if I had lived another life while I slept. In those moments, I wanted to reach for my phone, to hear his voice, to slip back into the old rhythm, but I didn't. I stayed still, breathing through the ache, reminding myself that healing sometimes feels like breaking all over again. One evening, I found myself standing at the edge of the river, the city lights flickering across the water. Couples walked hand in hand around me, their laughter echoing in the night. For the first time, I didn't feel envy. I felt possibility. I thought about the years I had lost, the sacrifices that had defined me, the secrets that had broken me. And then I thought about the life that was slowly, quietly taking shape. One where I wasn't defined by someone else's shadow, one where I could choose my own light. I whispered my mother's name into the breeze and imagined her smile, imagined her telling me she was proud, proud that I had finally stood tall, proud that I had refused to keep bending. And as I stood there, watching the water ripple under the moonlight, I realized something profound. The reflection staring back at me wasn't the broken woman who had walked away. It was the beginning of someone new. The final chapter of this story isn't about him anymore. It isn't about the lies, the secrecy, or the shadow of a love that was never mine to compete with. It's about me, standing here now, piecing together a life from the fragments of what was broken. When I look back, I see years of sacrifice etched into every corner of my memory. The nights I worked double shifts so we could pay the bills. The dreams I folded away because his comfort seemed more urgent. The silence I carried because I thought love meant swallowing my own voice. For so long I believed that endurance was the same as devotion, but endurance without respect is just erasure, and I refuse to be erased. There are days I still feel the ache of what I lost, like a bruise pressed too hard. I pass the places we once went together, smell the cologne he used to wear on strangers in the subway, hear echoes of laughter that used to fill our kitchen. And yet, the ache no longer consumes me. It reminds me that I survived, that I walked through fire and came out carrying scars instead of ashes. My scars are not shame. They are proof that I endured, that I chose myself when it would have been easier to disappear into silence. Now I fill my days with things that belong only to me. I take long walks by the river. I write pages in my journal until my hand cramps. I cook meals that taste like memory and freedom combined. I am learning the sound of my own laughter again, unshared, unrestrained, untied to anyone else's approval. And in those moments, I feel my mother beside me, not as a ghost haunting me, but as a presence guiding me. She told me once that strength isn't about how much you can carry for someone else. It's about knowing when to put the weight down. I didn't understand her then. I do now. If I've learned anything, it's this. Love cannot grow in secrecy, and sacrifice without reciprocity becomes a cage. I stepped out of that cage, trembling but determined. And now every breath feels like an act of defiance, every sunrise like a second chance. The past will always live inside me, but it no longer defines me. What defines me is the choice I made to walk away, the choice to stand instead of bend, the choice to honor myself the way my mother always hoped I would. So here I am, no longer invisible, no longer silenced. My story is not just one of betrayal. It is one of awakening. I am more than what was taken from me. I am the woman who learned to walk out of the cemetery of someone else's lies and into the uncharted path of my own truth. And for the first time in years, I am not afraid. I am free.